I think we're going to get started now on our panel titled "Yes in My Backyard," appropriately titled for a panel on housing. To my left, we have a really fantastic, I think, set of individuals here to talk about this issue. Starting directly to my left, Roger Valdez, who's a research fellow at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. I myself am actually, my name is John Harley. I should maybe introduce myself. I'm also a research fellow at the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, where I focus partially on housing along with Roger. We also have Michelle Reynolds here, who is a senator from the Ohio State Senate. She also chairs the Senate Committee on Housing. We're very, very fortunate to have her perspective as a policymaker on our panel here. And then we have Judge Glock, who's the Director of Research at the Manhattan Institute. So we have a really great collection of folks here. And I want to just start with maybe with Judge. I'm curious, like, what's your perspective, in terms of where we're at in terms of the sort of national YIMBY fight I think it's pretty much I think I think you'll get a lot of people agreeing with you that there's not enough housing supply in many housing markets in the U.S. and that contributes to housing being very unaffordable and certainly on both coasts, but across the nation. And we've seen some attempts at reform in places like Minneapolis 2040. Some things in California you hear, you can build duplexes there. What's going on in that nationwide battle?
Yeah, so not surprising, I assume, to anyone in this room, there really is no debate about what's causing increased housing prices across the country, and that is overwhelmingly the lack of supply. When I used to be a professor, one of my basic lines was, I told my students, if you ever fall asleep in my class and you don't know what the question is, just answer supply and demand. You'll probably be right, and then you can go on and get an answer. I would be blissfully unaware that you were falling asleep. That's the case here as elsewhere. There's not enough supply. There's a high demand. We're in an absolute, unfortunately, because of the current interest rate environment, we're in a crisis of housing affordability. According to the Urban Institute, their most recent report, it takes about 35% of a median family income to afford a house right now because of increased interest rates that have surprisingly, in the near term, squelched building, but have not reduced housing price significantly. But according to the most recent measures like Case-Shiller National Housing Index have actually hit new peak. So we were at just about 20% of a median family income affording for housing about 5-6 years ago. Now we're up to 35%, and that's even higher than the peak of the so-called housing bubble in 2006. But as John alluded to, we have seen many different efforts in many different places to push back on the lack of supply. We've seen that in places like Minneapolis, which I think 2019 abolished single-family zoning. My hometown of Austin, Texas, has recently been working to abolish parking minimum requirements in the city and also reduce minimum lot sizes. We've had wins on things like third-party permitting in Texas and Florida and elsewhere. And we've had a lot of effort in California, including this year where the California YIMBY movement has scored more wins on things like the California Environmental Policy Act requirements and the ability to build denser. Now, I think one of the things we'll get into a little more later, and I'm happy to talk about, is one object of concern is a lot of these previous YIMBY wins, the one that allowed more building, have not always translated into increased building. We can talk about why that has been the case and what we can do to make sure wins at the state level and even at the local level can actually manifest in increased housing construction, which is the thing we actually care about.
Super illuminating. I'm curious. I want to drill specifically in on Ohio. Michelle, can you explain to us from your purview as chair of the Housing Committee in Ohio's, what is the state doing in terms of housing? Is in your view, is preemption a viable way to sort of get housing supply expanded at any given state level, and what's going on specifically in Ohio?
So thank you so much, first of all, for Free Up for inviting me to be a part of this panel. This is very much a passion point for me. And being a freshman legislator in the great state of Ohio, I am privileged to be able to chair this housing committee, which is a very important committee. This is actually the first time that our legislative body is focusing on housing. And so we're definitely behind the 8 ball, but we realize that we have to be intentional because we have an affordability crisis and we have a lack of supply in Ohio. So one of the things that we are doing is our Senate president has delegated me to chair this committee, and we are going around the entire state of Ohio and all of the various regions to understand, what is the scope of the problem? What are we doing right in Ohio in terms of, the things that we're currently doing? What are we doing wrong? What are some of the barriers? What are some of the solutions? What are some models out there that we can certainly scale? And we're hearing a lot from the community. Obviously, it's different in urban communities versus rural communities versus suburban communities. But at the end of the day, we all agree that there is a lack of housing availability. One thing that I'm finding in Ohio is when you say affordable housing, it gets such a bad rep because that turns off, half of the people who want to talk about housing, it being a problem. Affordability means to some people, those poor people, and they don't want to talk about that. And so one of the things that we're looking at in Ohio is changing that conversation to be about workforce housing, because one thing that we are doing in Ohio is we just landed a $20 billion investment from Intel, who is coming in Ohio to build their semiconductor chip plant. And that's going to bring lots of economic boom and jobs to Ohio. But the problem is, where are people going to live? And so we have to address this problem. Now, you asked about preemption. And of course, it would be a very easy thing for the state to be able to pass laws and create policy that just tells our local governments what to do. However, that's not popular in Ohio. That's not something that we want to do. We don't want to play that role. So what we're trying to do in Ohio is find out what is the legislature's role in this conversation. And what we're hearing from our local communities is that they want our help. They want our resources, but they don't want us to tell them exactly what to do. So one of the things that I want to do, along with my colleagues on the Senate Select Committee, is we want to reimagine how we do housing in Ohio. And we want to look to states like Austin, Texas, who is doing some of the right things, like Montana, like Arizona. We want to look and see what can we do to reimagine what housing looks like. Obviously, that has to be a flexible approach. We need to do things that are smart. A lot of our local communities have zoning codes that are over 70 years old, and they need to be reformed. So they're part of the problem. We also don't have enough construction supply, so we need to look at how do we incentivize that. There's conversations about institutional investors that come and buy up things and make it hard for those that want to invest in home ownership. So how do we leverage that? How are we flexible even in our zoning codes? What about our property taxes that are rising, more than, people can afford, quite frankly. And so we're looking at building some sort of toolkit, if you will, some type of resource kit that will allow us to put together some public dollars in this toolkit, but do some smart things like maybe model zoning codes, grant money for infrastructure, for construction and things like that, so that we can entice those local communities to come to the table. And if you want our resources, then you have to essentially agree that there are maybe a couple of the things from our recommendations that you have to do. And we're trying to drive people more to the middle so that we can do housing more uniformly in Ohio. Right now, everybody's doing their own thing, and it's a hodgepodge of a solution.
Great. That's super illuminating on Ohio. Roger, I'm curious. There's been a lot of different faces of sort of affordable housing policy in general, and I'd like you to sort of just maybe run down some of the failures, successes, where we're at in housing policy, broadly speaking. We see sort of renewed interest in things like rent control. Places like Orlando are adopting things like rent control. A policy idea that we thought was sort of long dead. For example, low-income housing tax credits have sort of also sort of failed in terms of their promises to develop additional housing supply, and then also like the different faces of the YIMBY movement. I think there's, you've got the obviously the pro private housing, all new housing is good, you sort of equally, and then you've got sort of another group within the YIMBY movement that's very in favor of public housing specifically. So it's very yes to new public housing. Could you walk us through the state of the sort of national housing policy debate?
Thank you for that, John, because I think the title of what we're the meeting today, or the session, is really an opportunity to do that. Most of the YIMBY people are progressives, and when they talk about housing, they're talking about subsidized housing. One of the reasons why these measures in California have failed and to produce anything is because state government is so driven against the private sector that what they've done is they've mandated things or allowed things or whatever, conditioned things at the local level, but those have come with exactions, affordability requirements, and other limitations on being able to do the actual work that make financing those things impossible. You add to that the fact that I can wave a wand and say, okay, everybody can build a fourplex on a single family lot, but if it takes 5 years to get a permit and you can't move through the permitting system, then it's really a pointless endeavor. And then if you add something like 2 of the units have to be affordable to somebody at 50% of area median income, and you start, and no one that owns private developer can actually build the housing because we're going to prohibit, outside investment or whatever. Those are all things that the YIMBY movement, particularly in California, have supported, and so you're not seeing any change in that problem of higher prices, because what's happening is that it comes with too many strings. And so when we look at what can we do, I think preemption is one option in states like Ohio, where you've got really blue cities that are really driving a lot of regulation, but you've got a legislature that's more conservative, Republican. States like Florida and Tennessee and some other ones have been able to, at the state legislative level, kind of take actions to create a backstop against local overreach. But the YIMBY thing in and of itself has oriented itself around single family and abolishing single family zoning. And I've always said, let's just get rid of zoning altogether. And I think, in your state, where zoning was born in Euclid, just get rid of it. It's, as I've said, it's a 20th century solution to a 19th century problem. You don't need zoning anymore, because it was intended to keep like a rendering factory from being next to an apartment building. And we don't have rendering factories anymore. We've got mixed technologies, we've got high tech, we've got all sorts of, there's obviously places where you don't want to locate some, certain uses, but if you can be more flexible about those, then you get a dynamic where buyers and sellers can meet and negotiate price and build whatever they want to build. And I think that's, you still have building codes and building safety and fire protection and all that, but that isn't part of zoning, that's building codes. So that's kind of where I think we're looking. It's a balance of trying to incentivize private investment in building more housing and only subsidizing people with cash. If they're struggling to pay rent, you just give them the rent money. You don't need to build anything. And then for people that are really at low levels of income and will never be able to pay the rent, then you can sort of build and operate housing for those folks. But that's a dynamic that we haven't seen anywhere yet. So I'm hopeful that you guys can begin thinking that way.
So I want to go through all three of you on this question, because I think it's an interesting one. This is kind of a political economy kind of question. I think it's interesting that, at least in the U.S., a lot of zoning pushes for zoning has been actually pretty much championed by the Democratic Party, largely, and for a number of reasons. I think Republicans have been very, very careful not to get into this zoning debate. I think, unfortunately, what's interesting is you look to a place, for example, like Canada right now, where Pierre Poilievre, who's the Conservative Party of Canada leader, is actually crushing Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in the polling ahead of the next federal election, largely on the back of adopting like a very pro-housing kind of strategy. It's basically the centerpiece of his economic plan, because housing's so unaffordable in Canada. There's very little housing growth, a lot of immigration, so a lot of demand for housing. But there's a sense, especially amongst younger Canadians who live in housing markets that are almost entirely like the U.S. coast, think like Vancouver, Toronto, who will never be able to afford the home that they grew up in, basically. And so what's incredible is that this housing sort of centerpiece of Pierre Poilievre's economic policy strategy has led to him winning younger voters 2-1. And so I'm curious, and this is also the topic of my most recent National Review column, in terms of how Republicans can sort of look north to this strategy. And I want to start with you, Judge, in terms of how obviously there's issues of you're pitting incumbent homeowners against non-incumbent homeowners, but is it in your mind worth just maybe in a Republican economic strategy, the homeowners are going to get tax cuts anyways. They should be happy with that, even if more housing supply dampens their housing price growth a little bit. I'm curious, what do you think about that as a political strategy?
Well, I mean, I think it is possible to get both parties involved in this. And what you actually saw in both Arizona and Texas on minimum lot size votes, the Republicans were slightly more likely to vote for limitations in those states than the Democrats were. So it's not universal. You're right about the general trend across the country, but it is not universal and depends on what sort of cities and places they're preempting. In those cases, they were preempting largely, they thought, Democratic cities, and they were okay pushing a little bit back on that. One of the things I think is important to have as sort of a baseline discussion here is what works and what doesn't in the U.S. housing system and market. And I think the general assumption among a lot of YIMBYs that the U.S. housing market is an unmitigated disaster, that we have levels of unaffordability that are not paralleled in the rest of the Western world, is dead wrong. And therefore, they're misdiagnosing the problem. And they're actually proposing a lot of things that aren't going to help with it. By most measures, the U.S. has some of the most affordable housing on earth for a developed country. You look at things like the price to income ratio, the housing price to income ratio. In the 2010s, we were about, the average major metropolitan was about 3-1. House costs about 3 times the annual income, and even in pretty substantial cities. And places like UK or Japan, it's going to be more like 7-8-1. London, more like 10-11. The only places like that in America are basically California, New York, and Massachusetts. Most of the American housing market, for most of its history, has worked pretty well. And that's worked well by actually allowing people to expand outwards largely. They didn't have a lot of preemption bills in Ohio and Tennessee and Georgia and elsewhere, but they managed to have a functioning housing market. And then one of the ways I think they did that was by getting people into the growth coalition, showing them not how increased housing supply could detract from their housing wealth, but how could it increase it, which historically was the way it was done. I wrote a piece recently for a journal called Works in Progress called Growing the Growth Coalition. How do we think about getting more people involved in seeing housing as a win-win game? And the basic story I think that the YIMBYs tell on this often is wrong and self-destructive, which is, yes, more housing supply will lower your housing price. But in fact, the basic sort of economics is if you have a limitation, a shortage you're creating, you're actually limiting the extent of the market. You're limiting the amount of wealth that any individual property can produce. And unless you think there's a massive amount of externalities, pollution or traffic, or et cetera, by allowing more building, you're going to increase the value of people's housing in that area. And trying to think about how we can make sure that that message gets across, and crucially, that fiscal message gets across, that we show people when you grow your city, you have fiscal benefits to that, which historically was one of the main arguments for it. We said, hey, you allow people to grow, not only does that person who developed their land get increased value of their land because they can develop more, but they're also paying more taxes to the city because you have more property on that. And that can then be not redistributed, but that can be used throughout the community to lower other people's property taxes, can be used to increase services. Unfortunately, we have a lot of systems right now that I won't go into and talk about that are actually destroying that connection, that mechanism between increased development and increased fiscal benefits to the city. Things that redistribute property taxes, things that grants that offset increase value in local areas. And that's exactly what we don't want to do. We want to increase the growth coalition to show people how housing can benefit everybody.
So I definitely agree with that. You know, it's important for people to see themselves as part of the solution. And I know that as currently I'm a state senator, but formerly I was a township trustee, so I worked in local government, and I understand the conversation very much so with local residents, and they don't want to see a bunch of growth and development in their communities. Obviously, that's the NIMBY. And so, of course, trying to change that, it takes time to change that. But when you allow people to realize that they're a part of the solution, I love what he said about the growth, then they will essentially see that this is a win-win for them. And so one of the things that in Ohio we're entertaining is the accessory dwelling units, you know, being able to build in your own backyard something that is because you're a homeowner, it's your property, and you can do something to maybe take care of your in-laws, your aging adults in your family, which helps with other, you know, social problems. And so we want to do something that is smart. However, because, you know, Ohio is really big on home rule, we want to be able to respect, you know, our local governments. Now, there are some things that we can do, I believe, and we should do, that just kind of takes it off the table for them and says, you know, you will do this. However, we need to give them as much autonomy as possible. Otherwise, we lose people in the translation, and we don't want to do that. So I understand that certain things in research look really good, but in practice, we have to make sure that we are engaging people, they see themselves as part of the solution, and that makes for smart policy.
What do you think?
I think your point is well taken. I've written about that before, that this is an issue that the Republican Party can take because it's about free markets, it's about progress, it's about supply and demand, it's about fighting inflation. I mean, these are all central core principles of what it means to be a conservative. But what's funny is, like, when I get up and rally, I went to some Republican legislative thing, and all the Republicans were there, and I got up and talked about supply and demand and inflation and all that, and they were all, they were cheering, and then somebody came after and said, well, you know, these new developments don't have enough parking. And I'm like, God damn it, I mean, come on. Like, so I've often said that when it comes to parking, you know, you got a guy in the pickup truck with the flag driving around the block angry because he can't find a place to park, and then someone going to the Gaza protest driving around, and they're both angry about there's not enough parking. So there are some, you know, really unfortunate, you know, universal kinds of things out there that, you know, when people are looking for a place to park, there's no Republicans or Democrats. There's just an angry guy looking for a place to park, and they want you to build more parking. And they don't understand that adds to the cost of housing and creates the problems. So we need to, you know, I think one of the things I often say is we need to do some deep public opinion research, because, you know, the woman that's running with her baby in the baby carriage around the park, or the people coming out of the store with groceries, they all think that rental housing is passive income. They don't understand it's a marginal business, right? So they think that if you punish landlords, that you're going to be helping the poor guy, right? And this is, you know, we've run this in Ohio all the time, where, you know, local governments say, well, we're going to do rent control, we're going to do fees, fines, taxes, we're going to ban eviction during the wintertime, which they did in Seattle. And there's a perception in the general public that that's going to somehow hurt, you know, the man, or, you know, the greedy landlord, when the landlord is really running a marginal business, just like a coffee shop or a bar or a restaurant. And they're trying to deliver competitive prices and value to their customers, and then government comes in and hits them with tenant-landlord laws that make that increasingly risky and increasingly difficult to operate their housing. And so this is like a core Republican kind of thing. But so often you get Republicans, I don't know if he's a senator, I can't remember his name, but wanting to ban Airbnbs, you know. So you've got, again, this is a family business for many people, and this sort of resentment I think George Will was talking about this morning about there's a tremendous amount of resentment around housing because people don't understand how it works. So when they see their marginal disutility, I mean, Judge, you're exactly right. Like, I always ask audiences, does anybody know when the housing crisis started? Nobody knows. How do you measure the housing crisis? Nobody knows. It's a hobgoblin. It's really just, it's rhetoric that's ginned up by anti-property people who want to take, housing into a public sphere. And the Republican Party has just utterly failed to stand up and say, no, these are small businesses. These are people working every day to fix a toilet, fix a roof, and provide value for their customer, and we're making it harder to do and driving up the cost of housing and making it harder for poor people. I mean, this is like central stuff, but yeah, I mean, the Democrats have just run the board on this, and progressives and people that say housing's a human right. And it's like, I always talk to, when I debate my socialist council member in Seattle, I'd say, fine, it's a human right, but you still need to build more of it. If there's 100 people and only one house, it doesn't matter how much of a right you make it. You can't find a place to live. So I think we can get there, but we have to understand why people think what they do, and we have to start changing that.
You've never tried to fit 100 people into one house before?
Yeah, well, you can. It's going to be very uncomfortable, right?
So, last question, and I want to go again. I want to get everyone's take on this. I'm curious if political constraints were not a factor. What would be your one ideal housing policy that you would pass?
I would not, I think, like maybe like Roger or some others, do something that was like abolishing zoning statewide or something like that, because I don't think that answers to the demands of some constituents. And I do think it's important to remember there is demand for control of your neighborhood, which goes beyond municipal zoning. One of the facts I often cite is that about 2/3 of new housing construction in America is a community property association, either condominium or homeowners association. And they have levels of control over their community property that make the most restrictive city blanch. What paint you can have in your neighborhood, your mailbox style, when you can leave your car in the front yard. People are buying into that unanimously. So if the goal is like we're telling everybody that you're having false consciousness, that you are just confused about the benefits of housing, which sometimes they are. I won't deny that. But if we instead see YIMBYs as people who are trying to have rational discussions about trade-offs, about how to get them into the housing game, then I think we're going to have a much more productive conversation. So that's a long-winded way of saying that I think if I could do it, the best thing I would do was allow more competing governments to form. What you see in Texas, you have a great thing that can sometimes be a little overwrought and sometimes be destructive, but in general, very positive, called municipal utility districts, where a developer can go out into the sticks, have two people raise their hand and say, let's build sewer and water and a road out here. The bonds go out to pay for it. The bonds get paid down by the property tax of the new development, and they can start it. They compete with all those little municipalities. And the way to drive down the rents, both literally and the economic rents in terms of excess value for a product that has a shortage, is to create more competition, not just in housing per se, but in types of government and types of different communities that can form. So encouraging that competition at the municipal and government level, I think, is one of the most productive things you can do. Tie that to make sure the local communities keep more of the income they get from new housing, whether it be impact fees, property tax, et cetera. That's going to make more buy-in.
Michelle, what do you think? Fair housing policy idea?
Yes, I would actually create more home ownership by leveraging those that want to do investing, the institutional investors, with potential home buyers, and create a co-op so that they could co-equity share the properties. And so that way we could drive down more renter occupied and have increased home ownership, which we know is the key to really the American dream and decreasing the generational wealth gap. but I would like to leverage how our institutional investors who come in, who are really not the problem, they want to invest and they want to create housing opportunities, but they are in business, and I think that is a great leverage for public-private partnerships. But I also think that there are people out there who want to buy homes that could really use their help, and so creating sort of a co-op where they can partner together and own, the home buyer owns maybe 51% and the institutional investor owns 49%. And then when the house is sold and it appreciates, everybody, gets out their share and moves on. And I think that we can decrease that wealth gap and we can see more people owning homes. I'd like to do that.
Great. Roger?
Yeah, I would. I'm so excited that you're talking about that, because I've, in kind of trying to puzzle through closing the gap between black and white ownership in the country, which is worse today than it was when the Fair Housing Act was passed. What I've discovered is I think cooperative ownership allows more flexibility to gain equity, and it's a model of ownership that I think it's taking the money that people are spending on housing and turning it into ownership on a month-by-month basis. So I ran a little experiment on a 60-unit project at $200 a square foot, and it was something like, if we sold bonds, it would be about a $13 million project, and if we did reduced mortgage, reduced financing, so each household was paying something like $250,000, or pretty much cost of construction. In about 13 years, the people paying their housing payment every month would own that entire project, and the city would be paid back for the money it spent on the bonds. It could return that money into a revolving fund and do it again somewhere else. So this is a model that I think I'm excited to hear you talk about, because I think it's a way to navigate between what I consider to be an insane thing, the 30-year mortgage, which traps people in a house for 30 years, and very difficult. You're paying, in interest costs, you're paying like 3 times the sticker value of the house. And it changes and distorts the way people live their lives, and it involves a banking system and backing of the federal government that is very inflationary and has distorted the economy over the last 70 years. And if we got into a cooperative system of ownership, it would facilitate a lot more sweat equity in housing, and it would create ownership on a more rapid basis. And people would feel invested in that in a way that, the 30-year mortgage, you just never would financing anything like that. I mean, that's a crazy way to do, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't say that's a $400,000 asset and you're going to finance it for that long and pay that much interest, and have to stay in that one location for that long. So I think as millennials are coming up, they're starting to want more flexibility. They change jobs frequently. They want to be able to move, and carrying that equity, cashing that out sooner would be better. And I think it would shift us away from this. What Judge is saying is true too. You have to remember that equity is driven by inflation. So when you have scarcity of housing, the value of my asset goes up, and so it creates this punishment for people that, I don't own anything, and in order to keep my equity going up, I've got to keep it that way, right? So I think we've got to revolutionize the way we think about ownership and housing in general, and that's not just one thing, though. I don't know. I'm sorry, John. I didn't really answer the question.
Well, that's all good. I'm still trying to figure out the 100 people in one house thing that some friends think is still a viable housing approach. But Roger, Michelle, Judge, thank you very much. This has been a really great panel. With that, I will open it up for questions in case we have any, and I will give the microphone over here to Jared.
Yeah, Senator Reynolds, I liked your comment about how just on political realities, this is going to take some sort of carrots for cities, not just sticks. On things like rent control, I think the research is clear enough that that's something you preempt. But Utah and Florida have done really cool bills where in Utah they said if you want the infrastructure improvement funds that the states are giving out, you have to take, let's say, at least 3 out of these 20 steps.
That's right.
So then cities started picking that. A year later, Utah revisited it and moved it up to 5. And I think now it's up to 15 out of like 25. So even though the housing market there is not perfect, imagine how bad it'd be without that. So they stayed away from preemption and did more that way. And same with Florida, where the Senate president said she wants an apartment building on top of every Publix, which is a very Florida thing to say with all the how much people love Publix down there. But they went through, they had a big budget surplus, and they're like, how can we try to create at least the least poor way possible to subsidize this? And it's direct payments for just building. So I think there's lots of cool examples to look at, and while some of the YIMBY crowd does annoy me, I think they have some good points, but we need to start taking action now and not just be out yelling at legislators or calling everyone racist if they want to protect their most valuable asset that they have from concerns that they have about moving the price of it. So not sure if you want to add any comments, but that's what kicked off in my mind here.
Well, Jared, I appreciate you saying that because I got that idea from you. Yeah, with the research that you send me, and I love this carrot and stick approach, and that seems to be gaining a lot of momentum. And so we're looking at putting together that toolkit and with resources and our recommendations based on our housing study that we're doing. And from those recommendations, we will allow any of our local governments to apply, and it won't be very competitive, but if you commit to doing maybe 2 or 3 things out of the 25 recommendations, if you will, then you'll receive our support, and that's how we will help people do things more uniformly in Ohio.
Can I lobby you now? The city of Cincinnati doesn't know how long it takes to get a building permit. So neither does Columbus, neither does Albuquerque, there's no transparent measurement in any city that tracks how long from the time that I go to the permit counter and apply for a permit and when I get C of O. And that may sound like, who cares? But if you're going to be able to understand the dynamic of supply and demand in a market, you have to understand how long it takes to deliver that product. And the longer it takes, because the demand may occur in 1 quarter, but if it takes you 6 quarters to deliver the product, there's a lot of pain before that supply hits the market. And when I worked with the city of Cincinnati, we asked the planning director with one of the council members there, do you know how long it takes to get a building permit? They had no way of querying their database to answer that question. The same thing was true in Albuquerque when I asked them the same thing. They literally cannot run a program in the computer system to tell you it takes an average of 18 months or 24 months. And I heard from folks in Cincinnati it takes at least 2 years. So I think if you were to, in terms of carrots and sticks, you tell these cities, in order to get some of the goodies, you have to tell us, and I need to be able to go look at it as a citizen and say, I want to know how long it takes, and it should kick out an answer. And then the city should hold their permitting office accountable for shortening that window of time, because it's incredibly important if I'm waiting, and then you bring jobs in. And currently the way we study housing need is old census data and counting cost burden, which is in the rearview mirror, and then you've got Intel coming to create a bunch of jobs, and that's going to create a spike in demand. So you need your permitting people to be ready to go to permit those new units, incentivize the production. And it's a data point, but it's so crucial to know that. Right?
Two sentences on this. I worked a lot this year on a bill that passed in Texas that basically said if the city doesn't give their permit in the required time limit, 60 days, 90 days, whatever it is, you can go to a third party and get it stamped wherever you want. So you can go off to an engineer, you can go off to a planner, and they can stamp your documents, and then you got the permits no matter what happens. Great way to incentivize cities to move along.
I was trying to experiment where I live in Maine with cross-laminated timbers to see if there could be a quicker. And I ended up having to get it from an Austrian company, and a lot of the speed was taken away because the building code in Maine wasn't the same as the building code that they built the thing for. Could we ask the same question that John did about building codes themselves? Are there breakthroughs there that are along the lines of the zoning breakthroughs you were discussing earlier?
There have been some, the cross-laminated timber buildings are going up. There's places like Portland that have allowed them. And, but what's interesting about this is I get calls, or emails, a couple of times a month from, we're going to solve the housing crisis with fill-in-the-blank technology. The problem is it's the local permitting office at the state and the local level. You can have, this incredible technology and it's prefabricated somewhere off site and all that, but then you get to the site and the site dynamics are different in every site, and then the guy that signs off on the permits doesn't like it because it doesn't have the right specs or whatever. So, and then it's different in every 3,000 jurisdictions across the country. So I do think that the 10th Amendment, this is one of those dynamics I think with Republicans, the local control thing. Because you can't just issue a fiat right at the federal level and say we're going to have a uniform building code in the United States. You may not even want to do that, but that tension between, like I've said, with cell phones, you can be homeless and have a cell phone and afford it, right, and be able to buy one, but you can't buy a house. And some of that is because it's so, the regulations are so niche and driven by local concerns that it's not a uniform thing. And some of that is just the way it is to build something, right? Housing is different than a cell phone or from a banana or any other consumer product. But it is something that we have to struggle with, is that balance between allowing locals to do things and trying to be uniform about it.
I think that's it for. We've got one more question over here.
So, we don't have to answer them necessarily. Maybe just good to hear them and then
yeah.
we'll talk later.
Be real quick.
Yeah.
So something that Roger just mentioned about, some the inspector may decide, well, I don't like this. One thing we hear over and over again in our work with industry on this is the arbitrariness of how a lot of this gets imposed. Are you aware of any states that have like an appeals court or appeals process for something like this? Fire inspector or fire marshal is another bottleneck on a lot of this stuff sometimes. Is there anybody that's figured out some sort of recourse from some of these decisions?
Well, one is there's that third-party permitting now in both Florida and Texas, which just says you do it, you stamp it, and then the city has to go to you if they object to it. They automatically have to approve it from the third party unless they have to sue you to say we're objecting to it. So it puts the onus on them instead of you, which I think is the best solution.
I like that.
And one last question in here.
Yeah, my question, when we're talking about local versus and state versus federal, one of the ways you sort of indirect or backdoor federal government enforces its housing policy is through Fannie and Freddie. The government-sponsored housing enterprises now, since 2008, under conservatorship, and whether they should exist this way or should exist at all. Is there anything more that they could be doing, in your opinion, to sort of encourage the YIMBY, and how have they been as far as what has been their policy about some of these alternative permitting projects like in Texas?
YIMBY, I know Fannie was actually pretty open on some of the things like automatic title searches. They were actually at the forefront in allowing people to use algorithms to search for title insurance as opposed to actually having to pour through the old things. But in general, yeah, my dissertation and book was on Fannie and Freddie, and they should be destroyed. But that's a whole nother can of worms.
Roger, Michelle, Judge, thank you so much for the wonderful panel on housing yes in my backyard, and thank you everyone for coming. Really excellent questions all around.
Thank you.